The greatest test ever faced by the Sons of Guilliman, the Ultramarines chapter of Space Marines, began in the 41st millennium, when the first documented attack of a Tyranid Hive fleet descended upon the Imperium of Man. The first known contact of this strange new threat occurred on a small research station on the ocean world of Tyran Primus. The defences of this isolated outpost were quickly swept aside with overwhelming force, and the world was completely stripped of all life. Inquisitor Critman of the Ordo Xenos was sent to investigate and gather vital information on the strange planet-stripping phenomenon. Before the final destruction of the outpost on Tyran, a tech priest called Majos Varnak had compiled valuable data on the alien attackers during their assault, storing it within a data codex hidden deep within the outpost before it was destroyed. After reaching the now barren planet, the codex was later recovered and analysed by Critman, who then began to realise the severity of the situation. After reviewing the captured data and recordings, what he discovered was far worse than he ever imagined. Critman would assign the name of Tyranids, after the world of their discovery Tyran, to these previously undiscovered life forms. The enormous biofleet would later be referred to as Behemoth. Sensing the scale of horrors to come, Critman swiftly left the planet and attempted to establish contact lanes to issue a warning of this new threat to the wider Imperium. However, the astropath on board Critman's ship was unable to send the message through the warp due to the dense disturbances left behind by the passing Hive fleet. After failing to make any contact, Critman proceeded towards the Thandros system in the hopes of re-establishing communications with the Imperium through the use of their telepathica relays. It was on this journey that Critman's initial fears would become reality, as he discovered a string of worlds unfortunate enough to be caught in the wake of the Hive fleet. They had all suffered the same fate as Tyran. These worlds also included his destination planet of Thandros. With the trail of lifeless planets already left by the Hive fleet Behemoth as it ploughed its way through the galaxy, Critman's quest became ever critical, for the next systems in its path belonged to the realm of Ultramar, the home of the Ultramarines. Unless the system was forewarned, the Imperium might lose its best chance to end the relentless wave of destruction brought on by the Tyranids. The remains of Thandros' telepathica matrix was salvaged and used by Critman's astropath to broadcast a warning to the unsuspecting Imperium. A single voice replied back from the darkness, coming from Macragge, the heart of Ultramar, instructing Critman to report back to Macragge as soon as possible. Critman arrived at Ultramar with great urgency, ahead of Hive Fleet Behemoth, and met with Marnius Calgar, the chapter master of the Ultramarines. Critman hastily explained to the chapter master his terrible discoveries relating to the prior events. Being one of the most accomplished military leaders in the Imperium, Calgar listened intently to every detail about the approaching foe, so that this new intelligence could be used as an advantage for the defenders of mankind. The underlying message was clear. Hive Fleet Behemoth was fast approaching, and the Ultramarines chapter began preparations for the greatest battle in its history. Reacting quickly, Marnius Calgar deployed the Ultramarine fleet to intercept the Tyranid Hive fleet at the planet of Prandium. The Ultramarines are duty-bound to protect all worlds within the Ultramar system, and Prandium was the first in line to the Tyranid assault. Prandium is a lush, green garden world covered with magnificent crafted forests, and is known as the Jewel of Ultramar. The Ultramarines would not let this precious world fall so easily to the Xenos invaders. As the Hive fleet crashed into Prandium, the Ultramarines fared poorly. The tactics and strategies decreed by the Codex Astartes, the Tome of Knowledge followed by the Space Marines, did not succeed against the Tyranids. The deadly precision strikes of the Ultramarines, often highly effective against all manner of foes previously encountered by the Astartes, could not inflict enough damage against the seemingly endless tidal wave of Tyranids. Thunderhawk gunships were picked from the skies during their close-range attack runs, as they attempted to engage the enemy at optimum firepower range. These attack patterns favoured the Tyranids' mode of attack, allowing their spore scythes to burst and clawed tentacles to tear open many of the ships that drew too close. Quickly realising the inevitable, the Ultramarine fleet had no choice but to withdraw and sacrifice Prandium to consumption by the Hive fleet. The Imperial civilized world of Kath would be next to fall to the onslaught of the Tyranid Hive fleet. Kath is part of the realm of Ultramar and provides new recruits to the Ultramarines chapter. It is protected by a well-trained planetary defense force of guardsmen known as the Ultramar Auxilia, which acts as the first line of defense against any invaders. However, the defences on Kath were simply no match for the sheer scale and savage unstoppable fury of the enemy. It was upon this planet where a previously unrecorded event unfolded. A very large and aggressive Tyranid carnifex, which was seen spearheading the initial wave of assaults on the planet, was able to seemingly survive impossible amounts of damage, and yet continue to wade into battle, crushing Leman Russ battle tanks with minimal effort. This unique carnifex possessed a mutated ability to rapidly regenerate its wounds, allowing it to continue surging forwards, acting as a living battering ram to smash holes in the ranks of the defenders for the smaller Tyranid lifeforms to then flow into. Its brutal rampage was eventually brought to an end when an Imperial commander fired a plasma pistol straight through its eye and into its brain. Even after sustaining this catastrophic damage, the creature rose from the ground, missing an eye. The carnifex was easily recognisable to the defenders, as it was permanently scarred with a plasma burn running across its skull. It was later referred to as Old One Eye. Its final fate is still unknown. A week later, and with Prandium and Kath now nothing more than lifeless barren wastelands, Macragge was now the star system most immediately threatened. Marneus Calgar realised that his Ultramarines would have to adapt and develop new strategies if they were to be successful in the defence against the Tyranid menace. Fortified bunkers and static firepower would be used in place of hit-and-run attacks. Their fortress monastery, the Fortress of Hera, on their homeworld of Macragge would act as the centre of their defence. Thanks to Inquisitor Critman's discoveries at Tyran Primus, the defenders of Macragge had been forewarned of the horror headed towards them. Marneus Calgar formulated plans upon learning of the threat posed to Ultramar by the Hive fleet Behemoth. Further improvements were made to Macragge's already formidable defences. Orbital defence stations were brought online, bunkers and fortifications were reinforced, ground-to-air turret emplacements were increased in density, and even Titans were awoken to stride upon the surface of Macragge once more. Dozens of warships were already stationed in orbit above the planet, and each day more arrived from the warp. The expanding airborne fleet of warships now consisted of Imperial Navy destroyers, massive strike cruisers, and the colossal battle barges of the Ultramarines. The combined strength of these mighty defence systems would provide the approaching Tyranid Hive fleet with a far greater challenge than that found on previous worlds. A month later, the horror of the Great Devourer finally reached Macragge, and the greatest battle for the Ultramarines' homeworld began. The Hive fleet biovessels absorbed attacks by the Ultramarine strike cruisers and swarmed over the planet below. Mycetic spores started to rain down from the skies of Macragge, bursting open and spewing out ravenous lifeforms. Soon many thousands of these creatures scurried across the landscape, enveloping it under a living carpet of flesh and razor-sharp talons. Drawing upon his tactical expertise for battle, Calgar deemed that the Tyranid threat was far too large for his troops to face in smaller formations, so he combined his ground forces into 3 mighty garrisons. The first 2 garrisons were tasked with bolstering the defences of Macragge's formidable polar fortress and bunker systems. These garrisons included the chapter's most skilled and experienced warriors of the First Company, combined with the vast regiments of the Auxilia Planetary Defence Forces. The third and largest force of these armies was led by the chapter master himself. He deployed his force to perform a series of rearguard assaults, attempting to slow the Tyranid advance and eliminate the larger hive mind organisms, with the plan of diminishing the synapse control to shatter the Tyranid coordination. Calgar's actions in the ground assault achieved great success, buying time with blood for his battle brothers to the north and south. However, the onslaught of the Tyranids continued. The mighty Imperial battle titans stalked the ice fields surrounding the polar fortifications, laying waste to large quantities of the onrushing Tyranid horde, with Vulcan megabolter shells raining down and leaving smouldering impact craters from their plasma blast guns in the ground. Many Tyranids were crushed beneath their huge titanic feet as they strode onwards. However, the ferocity of the swarm was something that had never been encountered before. The defenders looked on as even the titans were dragged down and ripped apart by sheer weight of numbers, their void shields providing little benefit from the creatures leaping onto their chassis. Under the legendary leadership of Marneus Calgar, his forces whittled down and suppressed the initial land invasion of the Tyranids, claiming back ground previously occupied by the xenos lifeforms. However, these small victories would only delay the inevitable. During the fighting on the surface, a large brood of gene stealers scuttled further north, using the sewer systems beneath the ground which led towards the Sirocco starport. The brood then sprung an ambush on the unsuspecting starport pilots and defenders, slaughtering them with vicious rending claws. This surprise attack would severely cripple the strength of much of Calgar's shuttle fleet. Though the Master of Macragge still had access to his Thunderhawk gunships to redeploy and supply his Ultramarines, he now lacked the auxiliary forces that made up the bulk of his defensive garrisons. With options rapidly running out, Calgar withdrew his outer forces to make a stand at Cold Steel Ridge. The psychic synapse fields which made up the hive mind of the enemy began to quickly learn the attack patterns and strategies of the Ultramarines throughout the initial conflicts, and was able to single out the chapter master as a key target. It was at this stage of the battle when a deadly Tyranid bioform, later classified in the Imperial records as a Swarm Lord, emerged from the distance. This formidable creature was responsible for formulating and honing adaptive strategies, which it then used to coordinate the deadly attacks of the lesser Tyranid creatures during the previous engagements on other worlds in the path of Hive Fleet Behemoth. Those same strategies would now be employed against Calgar's defensive formations on Cold Steel Ridge. The warriors of Macragge suddenly noticed a drastic change in behaviour of the swarming Tyranid gaunts. What was once a mindless rampage of furious attacks now turned into strategic flanking manoeuvres coupled with well-timed precision strikes. Things began to quickly unravel as the synaptic linchpin provided by the Swarm Lord caused the death toll of the Ultramarines to escalate at an alarming rate. Calgar looked on grimly from the east flank, realising that his enemy was not the mindless swarm it had first appeared to be. As the defenders' line started to collapse amidst the carnage, the Swarm Lord extended its will, sending tunnelling Raveners and Trigons bursting up from the frozen wastes directly into the outpost trenches, cutting off the besieged defenders from Calgar's main force. By the time the Ultramarines cut through these subterranean horrors, the trench network was a gore-spattered mess, completely enveloped by chitin-armoured xenos. On the western flank, the Auxilia's Pride of Hera, a mighty Baneblade super heavy tank, continued to pummel the enemy advance with hails of bolter rounds from its multiple heavy bolter turrets, and devastating explosions from its massive Baneblade cannon. With the infantry support around this large rolling fortress quickly diminishing, it became exposed and was assaulted by a wave of advancing Carnifexes. These living battle tanks tore into the super heavy tank with crushing claws and razor-sharp scything talons. With its destruction, the Imperial's western flank was lost. During the next few hours, the Swarmlord continued to send wave after wave of the various Tyranid bioforms at its disposal into the lines of the battered defenders. Hundreds of Auxilia troops and Astartes were killed in the most gruesome ways imaginable, hacked to pieces, dissolved with acid, or simply consumed alive by the swarm of ravenous beasts. Calgar and his Ultramarines reacted to each new threat with courage and honour, despite them being heavily outnumbered. They fought tirelessly in an attempt to bolster the weakened sections of their battle line and prevent it from fully collapsing, but even the powerful Astartes were outmatched. Under the direction of the Swarmlord, the Tyranids were able to adapt to defeat Calgar's tactics as quickly as the Chapter Master developed them. With the Ultramarines preoccupied on all sides, the Swarmlord plunged into the fray, along with a bodyguard of Tyrant Guard and Tyranid warriors. The vicious creature headed straight for the Chapter Master, calling forth all nearby Hormagaunts to distract the Ultramarines in its path. The Swarmlord charged the Master of Macragge, knocking him down and tearing chunks out of his artificer armour with savage ferocity. Fortunately, his Honour Guard had broken through the wall of Hormagaunts to intercept the beast and fought before their wounded Chapter Master, their crackling power axes driving the Swarmlord back from the body of their fallen lord. With a glimmer of hope, the Thunderhawk gunships arrived from the orbiting battle barge Octavius and commenced their attack run to clear out a landing zone on the ridge to retrieve the survivors on the ground. The experienced and brave commander of the Honour Guard stood before the Swarmlord alone, as the remaining members of his squad fought to get Calgar safely back to the Thunderhawk gunships. As the commander of the Honour Guard fell, the Thunderhawks took off, evacuating the few survivors and carrying them towards the battle barge. Because of the Ultramarines' noble sacrifice, Marneus Calgar would live to fight again. However, the army of Ultramar had been decimated, and now nothing stood between the vast swarm of the Tyranids and the planet's colossal polar fortresses. With the efforts on the ground faring poorly, the battle above the planet did not provide much cause for hope. The initial assault wave of the Tyranid Hive fleet had claimed the mighty battle barge Khazar, consuming it within the biomass of the Great Devourer. Most of Ultramar's merchant fleet was swept away into the void by the time the third wave hit. By the ninth wave of the Hive fleet assaults, great holes had been opened up in the blockade of Imperial ships, and Macragg's Starnova stations had been rendered into mere chunks of debris, left spinning in the cold void of space. The orbital defences of Macragge were all but obliterated following the 12th wave, as the Tyranid invasion only intensified. As the battle raged on in space, the Tyranids concentrated on the polar fortresses by unleashing thousands of mycetic spores from the bioships above, which then started to pour from the skies to descend upon the remaining bunkers and fortifications below. The fortresses were vital to the defence of Macragge, and if they were to fall, many of the primary defensive guns would be silenced, and the world would be left defenceless. The ferocity of the Tyranid assault began to increase as they landed in even greater numbers than before, and many of the fortresses soon found themselves swamped by an ocean of the foul creatures on all sides. Never before has the valour of the Ultramarines been tested as it was in the defence of the polar fortifications. The veteran Space Marines of the First Company led the lightly armed auxiliary regiments in their stoic defence, refusing to yield their positions and holding every wall and bunker until the last possible moment before it was completely overrun with the Tyranid swarm. The valiant troops were slowly pushed back even deeper into the fortress, as their roaring weapons left piles of Tyranid bodies scattered across the landscape. Even though many of the xenos were shredded by concentrated bolter fire before they could even reach the defensive lines, the sheer mass of bioforms began to overwhelm many of the defensive positions. The perimeter wall of the northern polar fortress was eventually breached, as the swarms of Tyranids used the piles of dead bodies to spill over the tops like an enormous flood. The defenders' gun barrels glowed red hot in the Arctic cold as ammunition began to run dry, yet still the defenders fought on. Now that the outermost defensive guns had fallen silent, the larger monstrous creatures advanced unimpeded, and tore into the defenders' bastions like living battering rams, smashing their way through metal and ceramite-clad walls with astonishing fury. The Ultramarines now had to rely on heavy short-range firepower within the narrow corridors of the fortifications to bring down the enemy. But for each Tyranid that fell, another 3 sprang forward to continue the fight. The Tyranids began to break through the perimeter walls in more locations, but the Ultramarines never despaired and never gave thought to defeat, as they shall know no fear. All contact with the Ultramarines' First Company and the remaining ground forces had been lost after the Tyranids overran the surface outposts. They were still believed to be fighting deep below the defence laser silos of the northern citadel. Nothing was known of the southern garrison. However, the war in space was not yet concluded. Still weakened by the wounds sustained from the Swarmlord, Calgar took command of the surviving vessels and began to launch counterattacks against the Hive fleet as it spread out to surround Macragge. With many of its forces now deployed on the planet's surface, the Hive mind withdrew its bioships from Macragge in an attempt to lure the defending ships away, leaving the polar fortresses even more exposed. Surveying the situation and formulating a plan of his own, Calgar pursued the Tyranid fleet towards the outer reaches of the Macragge system. In a reversal of fortune, the Tyranid Hive fleet was trapped between the remnants of Calgar's fleet and the timely arrival of the Imperial Navy's entire battle fleet Tempestus. Even with the combined might of 2 battle fleets, the Imperial defenders were still outmatched by the sheer quantity of bioships. As the Imperial fleet started to suffer major casualties, the great battleship Dominus Astra, a huge Emperor-class warship, engaged the Hive fleet head-on in an attempt to draw in the enemy fleet and turn the tide of battle by concentrating all of its firepower upon the densely packed bio vessels. The battleship became overwhelmed and cut off from its surrounding ships, and as its hull was breached by hundreds of lashing tentacles from the invading Tyranid ships, it detonated its warp drives, sacrificing itself and creating a warp vortex that dragged both it and the entire Tyranid fleet to oblivion. The remaining bioships, caught between the guns of 2 Imperial fleets, were quickly annihilated, with only a few scattered ships managing to escape, retreating into the depths of space. With the destruction of the Hive fleet, Calgar's surviving starships immediately raced back to Macragge to save the yet unknown fate of the polar garrisons. Marneus Calgar dispatched the 3rd and 7th Ultramarines companies ahead in their fast strike cruisers while his remaining starships struggled back to their homeworld after the heavy damage they sustained in the battle against the Hive fleet. Drawing upon their battle experience for aerial assaults, the Space Marines of the 3rd and 7th companies descended onto the frozen wastes via drop pods, followed closely by their supporting units in Thunderhawk gunships. As the Space Marines made planetfall, they were greeted with scenes of unbelievable carnage and devastation. The piles of mangled bodies of their fellow Astartes along with the mounds of destroyed Tyranid corpses, now carpeted the ice fields as far as the eye could see. The foul stench of death lay heavy in the air. The 7th Company landed at the southern fortress unopposed and quickly linked up with the survivors of the garrison above ground. Reunited with their battle brothers, they pushed on to clear out the underground tunnel networks infested by the Tyranids. In the north of Macragge, the 3rd Company arrived facing a much more hostile situation, coming under heavy attack as soon as they emerged from the shelter of their drop pods. Hundreds of creatures began flooding out of the dark tunnel mouths and emerging from shattered Imperial bunkers to engage the newly arrived Ultramarines. Only the immense suppressing firepower laid down by the Company's Devastator squads managed to repel the alien swarm long enough until the Thunderhawk gunships arrived to blast the Tyranids back into the darkness. Captain Fabian of the 3rd Company prudently awaited the arrival of the Company's venerable dreadnoughts before proceeding into the fortress itself to begin their search for survivors. As the 3rd Company ventured deeper into the dark maze of corridors beneath the northern fortress, the walls became encrusted with a strange, dripping mucus, and the air became heavy with a foul stench of death. Screams and roars started to echo and reverberate along the tunnels. The corridors became littered with the corpses of the dead. As they entered a larger corridor, they were ambushed by lurking Tyranid lictors striking out from the shadows. The forward squads proceeded with flamer units to burn out a path through the darkness and flush out any hostile creatures waiting in ambush. Through darkness and terrors unimaginable, the 3rd Company finally reached the lower chambers of the Polar Fortress, where the 1st Company defenders had made their last stand. Tyranid bodies were piled high around the entrance doors, and within the room, a circle of 1st Company Terminators lay where they had fought back to back. Each had given his life for his brothers. The Ultramarines' 1st Company had been slain down to the last man. In the following months, the remaining pockets of Tyranid lifeforms were eradicated by the reinforcing companies. The hard-fought defeat of High Fleet Behemoth would mark the end of the First Tyrannic War. Though a few survivors were found in the ruin of Macragge's southern fortress, none were discovered in the north. Victory had been achieved, but at great cost. The Ultramarines' 1st Company was no more, and the 3rd and 7th Companies were heavily depleted. It would be many long years before the chapter could properly recover from its severe losses, but the Ultramarines had survived. The Imperial Navy also took a sizable amount of time to recover from its losses. In the recovery efforts on the surface, a body of a Hive tyrant believed to be the Swarm Lord was discovered on the corpse-littered ice fields outside the northern Polar Fortress. It had been too heavily damaged to identify with certainty, and it is rumoured that the beast had somehow escaped death, and that the Tyranids would one day return. During the recovery of the chapter, Chaplain Cassius received authorization from Manius Calgar to reform the 1st Company by drawing its new members from the ranks of the surviving Tyrannic War veterans who had fought valiantly against the Tyranid menace, as only these warriors could truly understand the threat posed by the Tyranids. Manius Calgar, sensing a future clash between the Ultramarines and the Tyranids, was confident that the Tyrannic War veterans of the 1st Company may hold the key to final victory. The Battle of Macragge remains a great source of both pride and sorrow for the Ultramarines. The sacrifice of the 1st Company and fellow battle brothers is remembered throughout the Ultramar system with great honour and gratitude. Although High Fleet Behemoth's threat to the galaxy has ended, its surviving ships fractured into smaller splinter fleets that scattered in all directions, which would later grow in size and strength as they absorbed biomass over hundreds of years. They would eventually form 2 new Hive fleets for the Imperium to deal with, and would be designated as Kraken and Leviathan. Many in the Imperium believe that the greatest threat to the Tyranids has already been defeated, but others believe that the fleets encountered to date are only smaller splinter fleets of a much larger and much deadlier main Hive fleet, as yet unseen, still travelling through the empty void towards the Imperium of Man.